The following may cause uncontrollable reflex movements of legs and feet. Kids WB does not assume responsibility for overturned beds or footprints on ceilings.
I don't know, but I heard tell the WB's the place. With them great new shows, anything goes, even worms in outer space. Got a tweeted bird, hot rod dogs, a boy named Jamie and a singing frog. We got WB's got people all having fun. Well, what do you do when there's nothing on TV?
Yeah.
Well, you turn that channel straight to the WB.
Word, number one.
Kids who live in a water tower, a krypton guy with superpower. Who's that front and set on down in front of Kids WB? The party's hot if I want a lot. Everyone's on a roll. Folks already influenced and Betty and everything's out of control. Well, we'll stick a bomb in Daffy's bed and drop an anvil on someone's head. We got WB's got everybody.
How's it going? I'm Evan Greenhill.
And I'm Zach McClure.
And this is That Cartoon Podcast. Today we're going to be taking a look at the rise and fall of Saturday morning cartoons. I think it's a thing we all remember pretty well. I mean, it was right about the time that we were growing up, and Saturday morning cartoons were a pretty big thing at the time.
Yeah, from what I understand, that's where a lot of cartoons really got a lot of its airtime.
Oh yeah, man. Well, I mean, that was the time when you showed your best stuff, because I mean, kids had gotten up. It was a weekend; they didn't have to worry about school. So it was the first thing you're going to do. You're going to grab some cereal, sit down while your parents are still asleep, and watch cartoons.
Yeah,
it was pretty awesome. And this is around the time that you saw like my favorite was Power Rangers early morning cartoons.
Power Rangers, of course. That was 1993.
I don't know. That's all I know is that's the first memory I have of watching cartoons. So I was about 4 at that time, so that would be around 1993.
But it didn't start there.
No, it didn't start. It started decades before that. Back mid 60s, really took off. Early 70s is when it really became like the niche market. You'd get up and watch, like Flintstones or Looney Tunes or Flipper.
Yeah.
And all these kids shows. And we didn't have, Cartoon Network then. We didn't have a 24-hour cartoon channel, which changed the game. And I think in a lot of ways, contributed to the decline of Saturday morning cartoons. But the 70s is where it really hit the stride and was becoming the big thing that kids would do.
What really I think started, just from some base research we've done, is that Saturday morning was kind of when kids got up, because kids are kind of known for getting up early, of course because of school and because Saturday was the day off. That's
when you got up and you did stuff with your friends. So
yeah.
They would show the prime material, because first thing you do, you got to eat breakfast. You want something to distract you while you're eating. You turn on the TV and there's all your favorite cartoons right there, and it became the thing, thing that we associated with kids in early mornings.
Yeah, and people who took notice of that was advertisers.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Advertisers would notice that kids would tune in at this time, and they could start advertising cereals or toys at that time.
Yeah, well, I mean, and this was that really hit its stride early 80s too, with G.I. Joe and My Little Pony back in the early generations.
Definitely, and they kind of realized with that they could team up with different companies that do limited animation, which we talked about in our first episode, where you have reusing film cells and stuff like that you could pair those together and have cartoons that kids could get up and watch. They sit down and watch cartoons for a couple hours and play commercials in between those, get them to buy their crappy little toys.
Really cheap, economic animation, and a really high market of toy selling.
Yeah,
you'd see a lot of kids that were actually have the toys with them and were playing with them while the show was going on.
Yeah, and it was a good place. It wasn't all just limited animation.
Thankfully, no. There was a lot of quality programming. Like I said, one of the big players at the time was Looney Tunes, and not really, like the Tex Avery more raunchy adult stuff happening, but A lot of the early Looney Tunes, Bugs Bunny, the Merry Melodies, things of that nature would play pretty heavily in this aspect. We got a lot of Flintstones and Jetsons, things that were tried and true, and had basically held onto the market for a good amount of time. Were repeated, and those were good quality shows. I mean, a lot of them did use some of the first examples of limited animation, but they weren't designed to sell toys. They were meant to be children's entertainment.
Yeah. And then we get to the 80s.
Yeah.
And then we get to where they had to make a law about what can be considered advertising in cartoons.
Because they went just
insane.
They went crazy with it.
G.I. Joe, Transformers, Thundercats, He-Man, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
It was a dark time for animation.
It was a time where everything had a toy. Everything had a toy that wasn't in the cartoon.
It was difficult because you had people that had throwaway toys that hadn't even been successful in previous decades, and they were trying to revamp them. So they just handed them to an animation company, said, "Make something out of this."
You have Transformers, which is we like this stuff that's being done in Japan, where we have these big robots. But we're not going to make a bunch of different shows. We're just going to steal these and make their own show.
And you have them taking from GoBots and all manners of other shows. That's why Megatron was a gun.
Yeah.
It was a giant gun. It made no sense, but it was designed just to sell the action figures.
An interesting note on that is one of the shows they took from was a famous show in Japan called Macross.
Mm-hmm.
And when they tried to bring Macross over to America, it became popular, but they couldn't sell any toys because Transformers owned their robots.
Owned all the toys, and it worked. We bought them by the bucket load. I probably still in a box somewhere around here have a couple of my old Beast Wars Transformers.
Yeah,
it's ridiculous how well this worked, and it really became, just a huge market.
And with that, along with the advertising, I think I can't be 100% confirmed because I was born years after this, but I think this is where some educational decrees came down, and they had to do some educational shows along with advertising shows.
Yeah, during I think specifically the mid 80s, late 70s, mid 80s, is when you saw a lot of the G.I. Joe lessons at the end, or the Sailor Says on Sailor Moon. The idea that you had to impart educational knowledge, because at this point cartoons were coming under a lot of heavy fire as being just mindless entertainment and not contributing to the growth of children.
Yeah.
So you got a lot of these aspects, like Captain Planet, where there's a moral to the overall show and then a specific lesson at the end of it.
Yeah, but even earlier than that, you have Schoolhouse Rock.
Yeah, exactly.
Which was a completely educational show. And yeah, you have the PS. Every cartoon was basically required to have a PSA at the end. Usually,
wasn't this part of the? I think it was like part of the Reagan administration, wasn't it? Nancy Reagan, do you think?
Here,
part of the.
let me look up real quick.
I think it was a small offshoot of the war on drugs.
Let me look up. It's part of the parents' lobby groups like Action for Children's
Television.
So it was definitely a lot more lobbying, and I think they basically had to set guidelines on. I think this is also where the decree on what could be considered advertising or not. Where basically you cannot put commercials inside of a cartoon, basically. Which I think G.I. Joe had gotten in trouble for
quite extensively. Well, I mean, G.I. Joe was I think probably the biggest proponent of this parental backlash, because I mean that show was about firing and explosions and death. And
definitely,
it was about fighting. And they had to, I mean, if you watch some of the old stuff, you can see how much they had to just change their entire dynamic for it in order to keep being allowed to produce it.
So, in the 80s, it started to get really, it's kind of started as a way for advertisers to get kids, and then the 80s started to really mash up. And while in the history of animation we talked about in the 90s where it kind of evolved into its own form without advertising, I can't honestly say that for Saturday Morning. It never really left its roots of being an advertising agent.
Yeah.
It did affect us in positive ways. We did get some really good shows from it.
Oh, definitely.
But I will go ahead and say that it was always about advertising.
Well, I mean, that's really that was the only thing that really kept it afloat in the beginning, because I mean you had these primetime slots, but they were children's shows. Networks, I don't think, were paying a whole honest amount of attention to it, but advertisers were paying out the waz in order to get those shows on the air, to get their products sold, and it was really working. I don't really think it ever left that area,
Yeah.
So as soon as the laws came into place that started restricting that, you begin to see kind of a decline, particularly in quality, as it goes by, because they're not willing to spend as much money to produce shows that are good on their own,
Yeah,
which they weren't doing a whole lot of in the first place.
definitely. So then we get around the 90s, which I will go ahead and point out, the Wikipedia, which we use for some of our research, points out the 90s as the decline of Saturday morning cartoons.
Which definitely indicates somebody, I think, born probably early 70s.
Early 70s, grew up in the 80s, probably wrote this.
And probably suffered a lot due to these G.I. Joe and Strawberry Shortcake related incidents.
But I'll go ahead and say, while I won't call it a decline, I will not either call it an apex. I don't think Saturday mornings really had an apex. I don't think it really reached a top of anything.
Oh yeah, it was really just a precursor, because I mean the 90s is when everything changed. That's when we got Cartoon Network.
So we got the rise of Nickelodeon.
Exactly. We got Fox Kids going on, which was part of Saturday morning, but it became this whole other thing.
Yeah.
And it changed animation. So I think Saturday morning was really more just the lead-in period to this whole bigger boon.
Yeah, but I'll go ahead and say we're probably more familiar with the 90s cartoons.
Definitely. Well, I mean, that's when we grew up, so we definitely have a lot more experience.
We're going to go ahead and skip over this real quickly, and we'll come back to this because we have a lot to say about it. And we'll go ahead to about 2005. I'm going to go ahead and say that's when I'm going to say. I'm actually going to go ahead and go earlier. 2003 is when I stopped. That's when I stopped getting up. That's when I stopped watching Saturday morning cartoons.
I actually stopped way before that. I stopped getting up as soon as Pokemon started to get mindlessly repetitive, which it did first season easily.
Yeah, but we'll talk about this a bit later, and I'll tell you how I know that's 2003. But a few years after that, I'd say 2005, 2006 is when the definitive decline of Saturday morning cartoons came, in that it literally declined. Blocks that used to be there, Kids WB, Fox Kids, I think PBS had a Saturday morning lineup,
Yeah,
and
they did.
there's a few others. Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon had gotten into it by 2000, I think. They had their own lineups. I think even Toonami for a short while had a Toonami Rising Sun, which they had. So you had a ton of stuff. But by 2005, 2006, I believe, Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon, they had all stopped having their own lineup.
Yeah.
Disney had stopped. Disney had not stopped, but they had changed the lineup to gear towards much younger kids, as had Nickelodeon. Nickelodeon had turned that area into their Nick Jr.
Nick
lineup.
Jr. Yeah.
And from there, Kids WB started to lose stuff. They started to notice that with the rise of stuff like cable satellite television, with the rise of the internet, especially I think 2005 was the introduction of the DVR, and I think that's what really killed it.
Yeah, because now you could record the shows without having to watch them and then play them back whenever you wanted, so it didn't matter when you broadcast them. Yeah,
and just generally, the people that got up during those times, the ones that relied on those things because they didn't have a way to watch them later, they're gone now. They're teenagers. They're
grown up, and now you have the young kids know how to work the internet.
Yeah, they can.
So you don't have that issue anymore.
And this was about 2 years into YouTube's existence, I think.
YouTube, I think, started in 2003?
I think 2004, 2005.
Okay.
Around that area. And There was a few years into YouTube's existence, so
And this is back before all the copyright.
yeah. But
issues
especially during that time,
Yeah.
and because they started to realize that bandwidth for streaming videos was now getting better.
Yep.
Before I'll go ahead and say, first episode of Digimon I watched, 2001, online on the Fox Kids website. I can't really show you guys this, but Evan, how big are my fingers right now?
You've got probably about
2 inches?
Yeah, maybe.
That's how big the screen was for the first episode of Digimon in full.
How long did it take to load?
Actually not long because
good, because of how small it was.
well, that and because we actually had a pretty good internet connection back in 2001.
But you remember back when you would have to wait like an hour to watch a 10-minute clip?
Yeah.
It was dark times before the internet, kids. If you're under 13 years old, just know
It
was it was a terrible time.
So all this stuff really compiled on top of each other, and they started to realize that we're not making anything from this.
It's not really working anymore. Yeah.
So it just died.
They a lot of them just sold off their shares or their company to other things. I mean, Kids WB basically died, and then WB become the CW.
They did I know that CW did Kids Block for a while, but after that they just stopped.
Yep.
And Fox sold off their block to 4Kids, and there was 4Kids TV for a little while. Mm-hmm. And then 4Kids entered bankruptcy, and that was gone too.
Yep.
I know that nowadays there is stuff on Saturday mornings, and there might even be more of a rise now, but it's not its own block anymore. It's just that you can see new cartoons at certain times, but
I think that's mostly just like the last light to go out. I don't think it'll ever permanently die per se, but it's not the industry it once was. Obviously, anybody who takes a look at it can see that. It doesn't much matter because we have all these different aspects for viewing cartoons now that we no longer need it, and it's 10 times more convenient now to have 24/7 streaming cartoons online and on our TV than to have to wake up at a specific time and go and sit down and watch it. And try not to be too loud because your parents will get up and they will be furious.
Absolutely. And so while there is still stuff that exists, it's basically a spinning wheel now.
Yeah.
It can keep going and going, but it has no traction. It's not going anywhere.
Eventually, peter out.
So we kind of skipped over an area.
We did. The 90s. This is actually, I think, particularly our favorite area because it's the one that we remember the most.
Yeah, it's the 90s. It's the chic right
Well, I mean,
now.
as we talked about in our last episode, the 90s had a huge boon in animation. It certainly was not a decline for animation per se. And in terms of a decline in Saturday morning, you can see that probably closer to the end of the 90s. But during the early 90s, Saturday mornings, and particularly early mornings period, were the thing.
Yeah. What I noticed a lot of it, and Saturday mornings in the 90s, I also point out, was the first time that we started to get live action shows.
Yeah.
Not cartoons, but compared to cartoons. We starting in the early 90s with Power Rangers, you'd get Goosebumps in later 90s. There's a few more that...
well, I mean, what's that one you always talked about with the Garbage Man?
If I remember it, I'll bring it up later.
I'd never seen it, but that was actually a pretty... when you showed me that episode, that was a really good example of how...
What happened in it?
There was this evil garbage man that had come to take this... I think he made like a mound of garbage, and this guy was coming to steal it. There was a whole song about it and everything.
We'll have to look this up later, because I don't remember ever...
Anyway,
I don't remember
it was something
at
you
all.
introduced me to. I just remember when I watched it, I was like, this is really, really good 90s kids entertainment.
But I think there are two things that the 90s really introduced to the Saturday morning lineup. That is live-action cartoons, and that is we could save money by not making our own animation, instead importing it from another country.
Oh, yeah.
They spun the wheel and landed on Japan.
Yeah. Because that's when we got Digimon and Pokemon and Zoids and Naruto and just all that nonsense, all that noise. It was the adventures of like something. I don't know. He's looking up that show now.
Yeah, and now I'm fucking curious.
It wasn't a cartoon. It was a live action thing they showed me. Anyway,
do you remember what channel it was on?
no, I don't. I never saw it. Is the point? You pointed it out to me. Anyway, but that's getting off topic. But we started importing everywhere.
Yeah, and I guess that technically started back in Transformers.
Well, I mean, it started in the 80s, but it didn't really hit the huge stride until the 90s. Because I mean, I think a lot of it had to do with Pokemon and the phenomenon that was. Because that was a huge thing. People who
it wasn't the Adventures of Pete and Pete, was it?
yes, that's what the one.
Adventures of Pete and Pete. That's what it was. Okay, yeah. I don't think that technically was a Saturday morning cartoon.
Was it not? It was. All I can remember is that it was good 90s kid programming.
All right. That yes, Pete and Pete. I think it did play on the Saturday morning Nickelodeon run.
But that was an example of the kids live action that we were getting around that time.
And I think the things that affected us so much is very late 90s. We have two shows that were imported from Japan. Mm-hmm. One being Pokemon, other being Digimon. Mm-hmm. And people remember Pokemon more often, but back in 1999, 2000, 2001, they were direct competitors.
Oh yeah.
In fact, I actually looked this up a little while ago. The premiere of Digimon actually the season premiere of it beat Pokemon in the ratings.
Okay.
And actually it beat Pokemon in the ratings a few times between its premiere of season 1 and season 2, I believe.
Interesting. At this point, I want to point out that Pikachu got a float in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and it's continued to have one. But I mean, that was the point. That was the competition. People were furiously divided about this.
They were livid about which one was better. And actually, we're going to be doing a mini episode later about which one is better.
We're both going to try to defend our side and probably fail horribly.
Go and tell you guys, Pokemon's gonna win.
I'm gonna go ahead and tell you. Yeah, it is. Because it's awesome.
But yeah, we'll definitely get more into Pokemon Digimon. But that is where we kind of get into the cartoon area.
Yeah.
That was my first introduction to anime.
That wasn't really my first introduction. That's probably my most defined introduction to anime. My first introduction to anime was probably Sailor Moon, which came
Sailor Moon, which was another Saturday morning thing.
Yes, exactly, which came out a bit before that. And I think that's really was the first kind of... That in Transformers was kind of the stepping stones towards this whole importation aspect.
So
and then when Pokemon and Digimon came over, it just... it summited.
So what do you think it was about that shows that really just attracted you at the time?
I don't know. They were colorful. They were different.
Definitely.
They were immensely different because the way that cartoons played out when Americans make them and the way that cartoons played out when Japanese made them. Japan has much more of a history of, I wouldn't say adult animation, but ambiguous animation by who it's directed at. And just the way that they do things culturally is different there. I just think one of the reasons it stuck so much is because it was addicting, and it was not something we'd been exposed to before.
Definitely. What I think, and the reason that we're making an entire episode about it is because Saturday morning, it sounds just like a generic time. Well, why didn't they play them on Friday morning or Sunday morning? I think it has its own legacy in that it's one of the defining things of childhood.
Yeah.
Everybody, at least in America, had the Saturday morning. Mm-hmm. Rich or poor, you could always get it. Because it was always on the beginning channels.
It was always on the public channels, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, PBS even had a section about it, and you can get that if you don't even have, like a whatever you hook up the TV to.
Yeah. And I knew a lot of kids that were not that rich that still had access to Saturday morning. And it's something that we could relate to.
There were 3 kids in my neighborhood that I hung out with, and Saturday morning we would all get together at my house because my dad had bought that big screen. You know,
Yeah.
because he loved the big. And we would watch Saturday morning. We had to be very quiet. My parents knew that they were there and they were awake, but they weren't about the house.
Yeah.
So we had to be very quiet. But it was a thing. It was an actual like activity that we engaged in, and it wasn't just us. I mean, that's what you talked about at school. You talked about
Yeah.
what games you were playing, and you talked about what cartoons you'd watch that day.
Yeah.
That was it.
Definitely.
It was basically your entire world at the time.
Yeah, and yeah, it's especially in the later '90s. It was a big It was just a big thing in pop culture too, because it was around the time that you really that when we really started importing stuff and shows started getting bigger. Because there were other shows that were on at the time too. There was Historia, I think it was called.
Hysteria.
Hysteria. Hysteria was a good show, and I heard like it's talk about. It's not as big as the other shows, but
You remember Wishbone?
I do remember Wishbone. In fact, I will go ahead and say one of the acting teachers at my school was a character on Wishbone.
Same here. The woman who did the drama club at AI was in an episode.
What's her
apparently.
name?
Ann Perry.
Ours is Sally something. But yeah, she played one of the neighbors to Wishbone,
Cool.
and she teaches acting. She teaches acting at University of North Texas. So yeah,
Yeah. But and that was one of the. I'd say that was one of the. That was certainly wasn't a big show, and
Yeah.
that wasn't an aspect I think wholly of Saturday Morning, because that was one of the ones on PBS that played. That actually you could get that at varying times in the day, but
yeah.
that was one of the aspects of adult or live action animation coming into play during this time.
I think with stuff like that, Saturday morning. That's why I don't really agree with the decline aspect of it, because I think at that time it's been at its biggest since it's been in the '80s when everything was about Transformers and GI Joe and My Little Pony and stuff like that.
Well, more importantly, we grew up at that time, so we remember the experience of being excited about getting
Yeah.
up and going and watching cartoons.
But even culturally, you mentioned earlier that Pikachu had a float in the Macy's
I
Day
mean, like
Parade.
people who knew nothing, didn't even watch cartoons or anything. They didn't know how to pronounce it properly, but they knew what Pokemon was.
Yeah, and you have the impact of like Power Rangers at
Exactly.
that time, which was another '90s product, and it has made impact so much that like it's been parodied. It's been
Oh, it's permanently a part of the way that we, kind of process and discuss and package '90s culture.
yeah
Definitely, the idea, like even on Drawn Together,
yeah
where they make fun of all types of cartoons. You have the Saturday morning cartoons. You have SpongeBob and you have Pokemon, which are both from relatively the same era.
yeah, and along with that, like we were talking about PBS earlier. There's another show that I do remember on there, Arthur,
Yes, Arthur.
which I think was one of their Saturday morning shows that kind of started in early mid '90s.
I think
I'll
so.
I'll have to look it up, but that's another show that had a big impact because it came around the time that Mr. Rogers was starting to tail off,
Yeah,
and
they needed something else to fill it.
yeah,
And what turned out to be a huge success. Too.
yeah, Arthur, Wishbone, those shows, Dragon Tales.
Dragon Tales. I think during the 80s and into the 90s, Reading Rainbow
Definitely.
was a big thing.
And so PBS is really the one that got the education thing.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, and one of the things I loved about PBS is they weren't doing the education like you had to have the PSAs and all that stuff. They were really engaged in the idea of passing on the older stories, like
Yeah.
the stuff that had been like the classics,
Yeah.
And they would bring it out. That's one of the things I really loved about Wishbone, and was also very confused about by Wishbone.
The only episode of Wishbone I remember is Prince and the Pauper.
That's the most famous one, I think.
That's the only one I remember. Oh, and Robin Hood.
That's the Prince and the Pauper. I think is the one that like everyone like pulls from whenever they talk about Wishbone.
That's it. That's
I
all
remember them doing Dante's Inferno.
I do not remember that episode.
They did it, yeah. It was weird.
But yeah, definitely, it was such a weird time. And I think at this point we're just kind of rambling.
Oh
But
well, I mean, and that's really the long and short of it, is that it rose to prominence during the 70s and 80s, and it started to trail off during the 90s.
we'll
early
go ahead and
2000s,
say
and-
that, despite the fact that I said it's probably at its highest in the mid to late 90s since the 80s, that doesn't mean that there wasn't advertising.
Oh, of course, it was kids programming. Look at Pokemon. Pokemon was rife with
Yes.
advertising. That thing was, because it was a franchise. It was an anime that grew out of the game.
Yeah.
And had all these toys and dolls. I remember we could go to McDonald's, and if your parents were willing to pay like $20 or something, you could get a Pokeball that had a gold-plated
Wasn't
Pokemon card in
McDonald's.
it.
That was
That was Burger King.
Yes.
Excuse me. Yes,
I remember that because I had one of those toys.
I had. My dad probably still has the 3. I had like Mewtwo, Pikachu, and Clefairy. I think maybe.
Maybe.
Or the cards.
Yeah. Pokemon cards, which I still have.
Pokemon, I think, really drove the idea that you could still advertise.
Yeah, definitely.
in the new Saturday morning cartoons, because that thing was huge. Digimon was certainly no slouch on that train either. I
Yeah,
remember
Digimon had its own cards, it had its own games. Which, by the way, PlayStation game for Digimon, awful. it was a broken piece of crap.
Pokemon wins.
Uh,
Remember Pokemon Coliseum?
yeah, that was a pretty awful game too.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, and this is the aspect of it, is that it's still, in a lot of ways, these franchises helped make this, a centerpiece, and then they adapted to this new growing aspect of just basically 24/7 cartoons constantly, and it's not really over. The Saturday morning aspect is over, but the thing
yes.
it represents.
In spirit, I don't think it's kind of weird to say that in the spirit of Saturday morning remains. It's not Saturday morning anymore, but the idea that there's now these set times where you can go watch cartoons, and it's said there will always be set times where you can go see these cartoons.
Well, I think more importantly, the fact that it's become more of an activity.
Yeah.
I mean, look at Let's Plays on the internet. Do you really think that people would be that interested in things of that nature if we weren't about getting together with people that we enjoy and experiencing things?
Definitely. And yeah, I was going to say that that Saturday morning, another legacy it had is that it helped sell the cartoon, the block.
Yes.
The block of
The idea of more cartoons more frequently.
which, if you move a day over, now you have in modern days the Sunday Animation Domination block for adults, which is kind of in the same vein of the Saturday morning, but it's now geared towards the people who used to watch it.
Yeah.
Because now
And it's kind of this nostalgia aspect.
it's the
growing
same.
up.
It's the same idea. It's
Yeah.
a block of cartoons dedicated completely to that, with the advertising directed to the people who watch that, and it's completely marketed to that,
Exactly.
to a specific demographic that is watching that,
Yeah.
and it's in spirit the exact same as the Saturday
Yeah.
morning
Well, I
cartoon
mean, and I
block.
think that's the point. Is it's supposed to play homage to the
Yeah,
Saturday morning cartoon experience.
it just now, instead of selling toys to kids, selling toys to adults.
Yay!
Toys like beer
Yes.
and cars.
So, go out and get some. But and that's basically it. That's the rise and fall of Saturday morning cartoons. I'm Evan Greenhill.
I'm Zach McClure,
This has been That Cartoon Show.
and we hope you enjoyed.
Have a good day.
Hey guys, this is Zach, the unfunny half of That Cartoon podcast. I just wanted to add something on the end here to say that starting from episode 3 and going on, we're going to start experimenting with doing a video podcast. So what we're going to do is have 1 week be an audio podcast, and then the next week we're going to release the video podcast following that. Not really much to show for the video podcast, but we're going to see how it works out. So look forward to that. Oh, bye.